Hey everybody, this is going to be a video on the first part of book 2. I'm not saying chapter 1 because I'm not going to stick to the chapters too closely. I'm not even going to stick to the text too closely. The early part of book 2 is dealing, believe it or not, from reading it, with a fairly coherent set of ideas. There's like a single topic being explored, I think. But you don't get that from doing the reading itself. You don't get that. That doesn't come out so much from sticking too close to the text. So what I'm going to do is help you understand the text by abstracting away from it and sort of organizing it differently, and I think better than Aristotle did. So what's the topic of the beginning of book 2? Well, it picks up where it should with where we were at the end of book 1. At the end of book 1, Aristotle said that the happy life, the eudaimon life, is going to be a life lived in accordance with virtue, an active life in accordance with virtue, or with reason rather, and that is going to be the same thing as virtue. So there was this tight connection between the rational part of your soul and virtue. And that might lead you to believe that Aristotle has a different approach to ethics than he actually does, because it might lead you to believe that for Aristotle, morality is just like the sciences, right? It might lead you to believe that Aristotle thinks that morality is a rational topic in the same way that math is, and so that you figure things out the same way you do in math. You start out from first principles or axioms, and you derive the truth from those axioms. And in fact, it sort of seems like that's what he's getting up to in book 1. He's trying to find out what the good is. He says everything we do is guided towards the good. That's our goal. So if you can figure out what the good is precisely, you can figure out you might even think a mathematical kind of precision, what you should do to get the good. This is kind of what was going on in the Protagoras. Plato had Socrates say, well, the good is just pleasure, and so virtue is going to be figuring out how to get the most pleasure over the course of your whole life. It's going to be a kind of calculation. This would make morality entirely a rational pursuit. I mean, what could be more rational than doing math in order to get what you want? But book 2 is going to reveal that Aristotle has a very different view. He's not going to go back on the claim that virtue and reason are tightly connected. But he's going to say that virtue isn't something you can acquire the same way you can acquire knowledge of like mathematics or geometry or things like that. So let's get to it. The first thing to realize about Aristotle's views on virtue, or the first thing to think about, is how you go about acquiring them. Now, what Aristotle says is that the way you get virtue is through habit. And this is kind of a surprising thing to say if you think that the life of virtue is just the life of reasoned action, because habit doesn't sound like a rational thing. Like being habituated to something is just doing it over and over again until it, well, becomes a habit, right? And we don't think of habitual action as rational action. So think of Pavlov's dogs. All right, so Pavlov's dogs, there was this guy named Pavlov, and he had dogs, and he wanted to run a science experiment, so he did, frankly, some mean things to a dog. He had a sound played right before he fed the dogs, and he did this over and over again until the dogs had gotten habituated to it, until the dogs came to expect the food right after the sound. And then, to test that, he started playing the sound and then not giving them food, and the dogs were like salivating and getting hungry. He had habituated them to it. There's a prank in The Office, which basically uses Pavlov's dogs on Dwight. This seems like non-rational behavior. Right? Especially if you continue doing it. Like, so the dogs keep getting surprised when they don't get food after that sound is heard. You might think, well, this is exactly non-rational behavior. How is it that a life of reason is a life of virtue, but the way we get virtue is through habit, this non-rational thing. Well, this goes back to the stuff Aristotle had to say about like young people shouldn't study ethics. And also his claim that if you were raised poorly, you're never going to become ethical. Because he has an account of how human beings develop morally. So this isn't just an account of what you should do, it's an account of how we make someone virtuous in the first place. And it's going to be, as we already could tell from book one, kind of a not so hopeful account. Aristotle is going to give an account of moral development on which some people are just lost. There's no way they can become virtuous. So what's going on here? Well, Aristotle thinks long before we become fully rational, we are still nonetheless developing opinions when we're children. Right? When we're children, we're seeing the example set for us by the adults in our life, an example about how to behave, how to treat people, how to comport ourselves like in public and things like that. And we are developing beliefs, non-rational beliefs, but beliefs about how you're supposed to behave. So, say the first point is the young have non-rational ethical beliefs. And this is the case even when the beliefs are true. So Aristotle is a moral realist. He believes that there are facts about what's right and wrong, facts about how you ought to behave. And so he thinks some people are right and some people are wrong. But even the people who are right when they're young are right non-rationally because all they're doing is absorbing what people around them say. And this is something both Plato and Aristotle thought was not enough for knowledge. Just hearing about it from someone else and not working it through yourself was not enough to give you knowledge, at least not in this area. Plato seemed to think, like not in any area, you had to figure everything out for yourself eventually. But we can leave that aside. But you can say the following. You don't have rational ethical beliefs, according to Aristotle, if all you've ever done is absorb what the people around you, your parents, authority figures, things like that, have told you is right or wrong. If that's all you have, you're stuck in an emotionally and ethically immature state. But everybody starts in that state. There's no alternative. So since everybody has these non-rational beliefs, it's important for you to start out with the good ones. Because if you don't start out with the good ones, Aristotle thinks, you're never going to develop the actual understanding. Why is that? Well, habit is the reason why. You start out with these non-rational ethical beliefs, and they're going to lead you to behave in certain ways. We've all seen little kids acting like their parents, sort of aping what their parents do, imitating what their parents do. And even as the kids get older, they're going to tend to keep a lot of those beliefs that they absorbed from the people around them. And it's not just your parents, Aristotle thinks, it's the wider community. And they're going to continue acting that way, even though they're unable to say why it is you should act that way. If you've ever asked like an 11-year-old to justify their own behavior, they're not going to do a very good job. Right? If you say, well, why is it okay for you to do that? And they'll go, I don't know, it just is. Or maybe they'll try to come up with a reason, but the reason will be really bad. Right? There are stages to moral development, and early on, all we're doing is imitating. But we're still imitating. We're doing the same thing over and over again. And here's what Aristotle thinks. What you do over and over again shapes who you are. You've probably seen on the internet that two wolves thing. Right? There are two wolves inside you. One is destructive and harmful, and the other is noble and helpful. I don't know how the story goes. But then the idea is, which one is stronger? The one that you feed. You know that story? This is often represented as a piece of like old ancient wisdom. But, I mean, Aristotle's ancient, so it's not like it's not ancient wisdom. But people have been aware of this all along, right? All Aristotle's saying is the kinds of behaviors you repeatedly engage in are going to be the kind of behaviors that you're going to prefer to engage in later on. Here's what habit does. Here's what the habitual doing of certain kinds of actions do. They give you pleasure, right? So what you do habitually shapes what you take pleasure in. Aristotle sometimes described this as second nature, right? So there's the nature everybody's born with, but then there's the tendencies, and like you're born with certain tendencies. Like there's certain things that are just natural for human beings to do. It's natural for us to be omnivores, for example, to eat both vegetables and meat. Right? It's natural for us to live in society with other people. It's natural for us to pursue pleasure. It's natural for us to have kids, things like that. That's natural. That's shared by everyone. And in that way, almost no one is different. I mean, there are some people who just happen to be born without the desire to have kids. There's some people who are born without the desire to experience certain kinds of pleasure. Like some people don't like having sex. That's a thing. And Aristotle would say they're unnatural only because they're so rare, is the idea. But he wants to say that there's another kind of naturalness, not the kind you're actually born with, but the kind that by the time you reach adulthood is nonetheless a deeply ingrained set of tendencies in you. And that's determined by how you were brought up, how you lived as you were growing up. It creates in you certain tendencies that are going to be just as hard to get rid of once you're an adult as the ones you're actually born with. Right? So you might notice that there are people who react very differently, but very strongly and very consistently to different stimuli. So for example, some people, like I'll use myself as an example here. I hate this smell of cigarette smoke. If I can smell cigarette smoke on someone, I just feel disgusted. I got to get out of there. It makes me look down on the people who smell like cigarettes, things like that. And that's because when I was a kid, my dad smoked and my mom made him go out on the porch. And so I always had the negative association that's built up and built up and built up. And for me, it's not something I can do anything about. I can't I can't like reason my way out of my distaste for cigarettes and the smell of cigarettes. As a sign of this, right? As a sign of the fact that like this isn't just, well, I've decided cigarettes are bad for me, so that's why I don't like it. Because if that was what it was, then presumably if I could be convinced that cigarettes aren't that bad for you, I could, drop the whole disgust reaction at cigarettes. I don't have a disgust reaction to cigars. Cigars smell fine to me, right? What's the difference? Well, the difference is I didn't actually grow up with any associations with cigars, right? I mean, cigars do smell different, but it's not like one of them smells really good and one of them smells really bad. I've just got this second nature aversion to cigarette smoke. And we all develop these. Right? There's all sorts of things that are true about you. There's all sorts of things that you have a tendency to do or to like or to want that you weren't born with, but got ingrained really early on. So here's what Aristotle says. We have these non-rational ethical beliefs from a very young age, well before we're in a position to reason effectively about anything. Those non-rational ethical beliefs shape how we behave, and how we habitually behave, shapes what we like. Right? Because what is natural to you is usually going to be something you like. That's not always true, but Aristotle thinks usually it's true. Remember that point I made in an earlier video that Aristotle thinks that almost any kind of life is one you can take pleasure in. Right? If you really like something, or if you do something enough, you're going to eventually take pleasure in it. For the most part. There's some things that like you'll never take pleasure in if you do them enough. But you've probably had this experience yourself. Something you didn't initially like, you did enough until now you actually do like it. A lot of people who say they like running will admit they didn't like running when they started. I'll say I'm someone who didn't like running when I started. I ran for a while and it didn't work on me. I still don't like to run. Running is awful. But mostly just because it's boring. Like, what are you doing? Like before iPods and then iPhones or any kind of smartphone, running was just awful because what we had were CD players, and if you ran with a CD player, it would skip, so you couldn't listen to music. Now, like nowadays, if you run and you've got like any kind of audiobook you want or podcast or song, I can see how it would be more fun. But anyway, most things, however, the way it works is if you get used to them, you start to take pleasure in them. Just think about the things that when you were a little kid you used to do. And you might think objectively they're not that cool, but just because I did them so much when I was a little kid, or because I ate this meal a lot when I was a little kid, or I went to this place when I was a little kid, it is more fun for you than it would be for someone who didn't do it. Right? You might have even had this experience of like bringing a friend to your house when you were like younger and having them, or bringing them to your house and having your parents serve them your favorite meal, and they're like, "This is nothing special," and you're like, "What are you talking about? This is the greatest thing ever." Right? So what we do habitually shapes what we take pleasure in. So if you have true ethical beliefs, they will guide your action to what's actually good, and you will learn to take pleasure in doing what's actually good. If you have false ethical beliefs, it's going to be the case that you will learn to take pleasure in things that are bad and that you ought not do. And this is important because Aristotle says that it's a key fact about virtue, that virtuous action must be done for its own sake. If you do the virtuous thing because you want to get something else out of it, then it's not really virtuous. Plato had this same idea. Although, as we're going to see when I get to the how are Plato and Aristotle similar and how are they different, there is a difference between Plato and Aristotle on this point. But it's not a difference about the following claim that they both accepted. A truly virtuous person will want to do what's virtuous for its own sake. Plato's going to say they also want to do it for other reasons, but Aristotle thinks, no, if you are truly virtuous, if you're doing the virtuous thing, the only way that could be true is if you're doing it for its own sake, not because of what it can get you. Right? So remember at the beginning of the Republic, Glaucon and Adeimantus said they could understand how justice was worth pursuing because of how it helped your reputation, and they asked Plato to show a different reason to pursue or to prefer what's just besides your own benefit, and that's what the whole job of the Republic is. Aristotle's making the same point here, that a truly virtuous person, a person who's truly just, will do just actions because they're just. So if you have two people and they do the exact same thing, one of them could be doing the virtuous thing and one of them could not because of their goals. So someone who returns what is owed because they want the benefit to their reputation, or someone who engages in charity because they want other people to think well of them, is not actually doing the virtuous thing at all, whereas someone who does it just because they respect the rights of others, or they respect the well-being of others, they care about the well-being of others, that person will be truly virtuous. And the only way, Aristotle thinks, that you're going to be able, at any point in your life, to do the virtuous thing, to pursue virtue for its own sake, is if you learn to love virtue, which means you learn to take pleasure in doing it. So we need habit because there's a natural sequence to human life. And by the time we get to the point where we can reason effectively about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, we already have certain habits. And if those habits are bad habits, Aristotle thinks, you're never going to get to the point where you're truly virtuous, because you're not going to love virtue. You're going to love whatever it is you were brought up to love. So habit plays a role like this because not only do we have non-rational parts to us, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but because over the course of our life, we have non-rational periods of our life. And those periods are unfortunately the periods in which our character is formed. So we need habit, or we're going to have habit either way. I think this is Aristotle's point. No matter what happens, you're going to develop certain character traits through habitual performance of actions. And that's either going to be virtuous actions or vicious actions. And if you're unlucky enough to have developed vicious habits as a kid, probably because you were brought up poorly, Aristotle's going to say you probably can't ever become virtuous because you'll never learn to love virtue. All right, I'm going to pick this up in another video about the role of pleasure in the good life, or in the life of virtue.